it's that kind of mindset and philosophy that makes you stop thinking about, is it money? Is it time? Is it energy? It's all of those things. It's the words we speak. It's how we speak them. It's the time we spend. It's how we spend it. It's the money we earn. It's the difference between getting your check on Friday and looking down and going, oh, thank God I got my check, and looking down at your check and going, thank God I got my check.
Thank you for joining us for another fire conversation. I have a special guest today. We have Scott Maderer, and he's going to be sharing some insights into how we can apply biblical stewardship principles to our lives. So he has an awesome background. We're going to be able to get into all of that. Some people have had bad experiences when it comes to money, when it comes to preachers, church, all of that. But hopefully we can have a more balanced and biblical understanding of stewardship. So thank you, Scott, for coming on. How did you come to develop a relationship with Christ? How were you first introduced to the Lord? What did that look like? And how did that lead you to where you are today?
Sure. So I grew up in the church. I was actually raised in the Methodist church. My mother and father took me to church regularly. I was part of the youth group. I did liturgy. I did a lot in the church. And I actually even felt a pretty deep call towards the ministry early in my life. I thought I was going to become a pastor. I felt that kind of call on my heart. And then as I got older in my teen years and approaching college age, I had some experiences, honestly, with folks in the church and with my own personal life and my relationship with my father. My father was an alcoholic. He was abusive to my mother, to my sister, and other things. And I was growing up in kind of that environment. And yet at the same time, in the church environment, my dad was looked at as kind of this very, godly man, because that's kind of the face he wore out in the street and going to church. And so I was torn, and I actually left the church. I claimed I became an atheist. I really didn't. I became an agnostic and began to do a lot of studies of religion. I visited a lot of different churches. I began to read in not just on Christianity, but on other faiths and other backgrounds, and sort of almost kind of became an intellectual student of it. But I actually didn't set foot in another church for over 25 years. So I kind of went from being deeply in, feeling called to the ministry, to leaving it. And it was because of what happened with church people. I laugh and tell people that as a Christian, one of my favorite prayers is, Lord, please save me from your people. Because, so sometimes as Christians, we don't always walk out what I at least believe is the message that the Lord has for us as an example of the way to live, and that kind of conflict. Now, as I've gotten older, I also realized if there was ever a church out there that was only filled with perfect people, they wouldn't let me in anyway. So, I stopped looking because it's like, oh, never mind. They wouldn't let me in anyway. I'm nowhere close to perfect. But over time, I began to kind of feel the call to return to church. My wife and I had a son, and I began kind of going back to having that relationship. And as I did, I also realized that I'd never really left my relationship with God. What I had left is my relationship with church. And those were two different things, both important and both things that I felt, were meaningful in my life, but they were also different. And I was able to separate those and realize that I could return to church. I could get involved. I'm now highly involved back in the Methodist church. I do a lot of leadership development, a lot of lay training, a lot of pulpit fill. Pastors often invite me to come in and preach on money so that they don't have to, because quite frankly, they don't like preaching on money.
Right.
So I've done a lot of stewardship campaigns over the years, not just in my church, but in others. And so I kind of able to, come back to the church, but also recognize that relationship I had with Christ, that feeling and that call on my heart never really went away. It was, how do I play that out and how do I live that out in the world? That's what shifted over time.
Okay. Wow. And I think that that's really important that you said that, right? You just because you are not in a like an organized church situation, it doesn't mean that you have walked away from God, right? Because
Mm,
now I know that depending on the church that people come from, sometimes people will make them feel like that, like, oh, we haven't seen you in a while. I remember that, experiencing that one time where just because I wasn't going to this one church in particular. So some people from there, they saw me later and they said, hey, we haven't seen you in a while. Are you still saved?
mhm,
And I was like, yeah, I hope so. I haven't, walked away from the Lord or anything like that. I just have chosen not to come here. Right.
mm.
But some people equated being there as being in the will of God. Like there was something special about that particular location. So,
Yeah, I've always found it ironic that we'll say in one breath, God is everywhere, but
mhm.
then in the next breath, it's like, but God is only really here.
Right.
You know, it's kind of like, wait, those can't both be true. I don't understand where you're coming from, and yet,
Mhm.
yeah, I agree with you. I've had that same experience where people have equated a particular church or a particular denomination or a particular set of rules or strictures or this sort of thing as being the one thing that determines whether or not you're saved, whether or not you truly have a relationship. The irony for me is that people always pick the things that they're already doing
Mhm.
as the things that are the requirements and whatever you know what I mean? But if somebody else is doing something slightly different, well, that's not in bounds. But this over here that I'm already doing, that's in bounds. So that's more about self and that's more about our own. I don't see that as really coming out of a relationship with God as much as it comes out of a prideful place of kind of us being able to determine. Because, I don't know about you, but I figure being saved or not, that decision is above my pay grade. I don't get to make it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And yeah, there are unfortunately a lot of people who are turned off by the church, and it's not because they have a problem with God, but maybe they just have a problem with the way that God is being presented to them. And a lot of it comes down to, well, there's a lot of things, but one of the big things is money.
Mhm.
So I think that that's why it's so important that we're going to have this discussion today about that, because some people say, well, oh, this church, they just want my money. They don't really care about me and my family. They just want something from me. But if I ever need something, if I'm going through something, I can't really count on them.
Mhm.
They can count on me for that 10%, but I can't count on them when I'm going through something. So
Mm.
I do think a lot of people are disillusioned from the church because of that. But it has nothing to do with the true nature of God, but a distorted view. So before we get specifically into the stewardship aspect of it, I know that one thing that's important for you is helping people to understand and identify their calling,
Mhm.
right? And what that means for an individual person. So you have a background using different tools like personality assessments, like the DISC assessment,
Mhm.
and things like that to help people kind of understand more about how God created them. So can you speak a little bit on that as it just relates to purpose and understanding maybe what God wants to do in somebody's life?
Yeah. I think a lot of it, first off, for me, one of the reasons that I talk about identifying your calling is because to me, that is part of stewardship.
Mhm.
We often focus on, and I know, today in our conversation, we're going to focus on the stewardship of money, but recognize that the word stewardship, and we'll talk more about this and I can define it and that kind of thing. It's much more than just money. That's just one small slice of it. And I
Mhm.
actually believe identifying your calling, kind of figuring out, what has God built you and wired you to do is part of being good stewards of what God has put into our life. Because the truth is, if you identify those giftings and those callings and those directions that God has put on your life, and then you start to live that out, I actually think you make a bigger impact. And here I don't mean bigger impact in terms of like, necessarily you're on the stage like a Tony Robbins in front of 50,000 people.
Right, right.
That's not what I mean by impact. I just mean that the lives that you touch, the ripples you put out into the world, they spread further. They go deeper. They have a bigger touch to other people. And even if that's just one person,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter. You've changed the entire world. That impact spreads out because, as an example, I used to be a school teacher. I've got students that I taught that now are doctors. Well, every patient that they treat, I have a little bit of that. You know what I mean? In terms
Mm-hmm.
of the impact I made on that kid is now making an impact on every person they treat. I'm not a doctor. I'm not treating anybody. And yet that's by stewarding my gifts, I was able to have that impact. So when you think about calling, I look at it as sort of identifying what is it in your life that in a way it gives you energy. I try to avoid the words like passion and purpose simply because I think a lot of times, you hear this advice like, oh, if you just follow your passion, everything will work out for you. And that's baloney. That's not true. That is just a lie. It's sort of like saying, if you become a Christian, your life will be easy. Or, if you don't have money, well, it means your faith isn't deep enough. And you hear these sorts of messages. And unfortunately, we hear them a lot in the Christian church. And yet that's not biblical. That's not what, Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow me. He didn't say, follow me down the yellow brick road.
Right.
There's an implication there that there's might be some pain in this journey, yet that you're making a choice to do something that's hard, but it's worth it. Same thing comes with identifying our calling. So real quick, just a practical tip for people. If you sit down and I'm going to give you two quick exercises. One is looking backwards and one is looking forwards. So the looking backwards one is just simply sit down with a sheet of paper and kind of start writing down on it everything that you've done. And I don't just mean jobs. I mean, babysit kids. I mean, camp counselor. I mean, whatever. Okay. Relationships, interactions, activities, hobbies. I don't care. It's wide open. Everything that you can think of. And then next to each of those items in one column, put, what did I love about this? What gave me energy? What gave me joy? What did I enjoy? And then in the next column, write, what did I not love about this? What was it about it that took energy from me or that I didn't enjoy? And just keep doing that. And I've had people sometimes write 10, 20, 30 pages of this. It's just getting information out of your head and onto paper. And then begin to look for patterns of that. Look for the things that keep showing up. Look for the things that keep bubbling up in terms of this gives me energy. Also look for the things that keep bubbling up that are like, these takes energy away from me. And you've already started to get an inkling of the direction maybe you should go because those things that are giving you energy are probably more aligned with what you're wired to do, what God has created you and put you on the planet to do. So how can I do more of that and avoid some of the other stuff? By the way, avoiding the stuff that you don't love doesn't mean getting rid of all of it. There's a certain amount of stuff that you're going to have to do that's not fun and you're not going to enjoy it. Doing the laundry. Very few people have ever told me that their calling is to do laundry.
Right.
I'm sure there's someone out there. I haven't met them yet. So those sorts of things, there's just a certain amount of stuff you have to do just because you're alive, you're on the planet, and it requires work and effort and energy. But you can do more of those things that give you that energy. So real quick, the looking forward exercise, I call this the airport question. I used to work corporate. I spent a lot of times in airports. So I set this in an airport. Imagine for a minute, you're walking through an airport. You're on that connecting flight. So you've landed at the airport. You're now supposed to connect to another flight and fly out and get on home. This is the worst place in the world to have this happen. But as you walk up to your flight, you look up there and you see those dreaded words, flight delayed. Turns out you now magically have a 4-hour layover that you didn't have before. So you do what anyone does in an airport. When you've got a 4-hour layover and you're stuck in between, you go either find a restaurant or a bar to have either something to eat or something to drink. That's what everybody does. Mm-hmm. So as you walk into that restaurant, I don't drink, so I'm going to put it in a restaurant. As you walk into that restaurant, you happen to look up and you see sitting at a table a friend of yours that you haven't seen for 5 years. This is 5 years in the future. For whatever reason, you just fallen out of contact. You haven't had a conversation with this person for several years. And you look over and it's like, hey, Jason, man, how you doing? I haven't seen you in so long. It's so great. Turns out they've got a layover too. You both grab a bite. You get a quiet table in the corner, if you can find one in an airport, but you grab a quiet table in the corner. Your friend looks at you and goes, man, it is great to see you. How have the last 5 years been? And you look at them and you say, you know what? This has been the best 5 years of my life because. Now, your job is to write for me what comes after the word because. Tell me what 5 years in the future would make you look at this friend and say, this has been the best 5 years of my life. What's happened in your money? What's happened in your relationships? What's happened in your job, your career? What's happened in your spiritual walk and that part of your life? What's happened in all of these different components of your life that would make you truly and honestly say, this has been the best 5 years of my life? Now, between those two exercises, you've probably been able to bubble out of that some idea of where you should spend time and effort working towards. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen instantly, but bringing your life more in alignment with what God has called you to do.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that sometimes we can make it more complicated, right? Because I know a lot of people who will say they'll say, I've just been praying, asking God to reveal to me what His will is for my life, right? And it's like, okay, well, what do you like? And let's just say this is somebody who maybe they grew up on a farm, right? So they really like agriculture. There's somebody who is really good with working with their hands and they understand, crops and seasons and they love being outdoors, all that. And it's like, so what do you think God is placing on your heart? I don't know. Maybe I'm supposed to be an accountant.
Yep.
Like, really? You think so? Why? Oh,
Well, that's
because
because that's how I make money.
yeah, yeah, because people focus on, well, it's probably the thing that makes the most money. That's what God wants me to do. But
Right. Well,
you know,
and that's important to recognize. I'm talking about identify your calling, not necessarily your career.
right? Okay,
Okay.
okay.
And those can be the same thing. I mean, right now for me, my calling, helping others, helping develop others, helping other people figure out how to get unstuck and move forward and be more authentic. My mother will tell you that's how I was doing that when I was 8 years old.
Mhm.
I was the kid that every other kid came to for advice. It made dating in high school really tough because I was the guy that all the girls came to for advice. I didn't get to date a lot, but all the girls knew me, that kind of thing, because that's just who I was. That's how I'm wired. Well, now as a coach, that's what I do every day. So my career and my calling are aligned, but they don't have to be. I actually know people that do that work as an accountant,
Mhm.
but then use that, even though that's not really their calling, it's something they're good at. It's something they can do. They don't dislike it, but it's not really 100% their calling. But then they use that to fund being able to have the time and the freedom and the effort to do this other thing over here that really is their calling, but maybe isn't able to quote pay the bills. So, realize these are two different things. They can be perfectly aligned and they can also not be. That's okay. The word career actually comes from the Latin word for cart, something to get you from point A to point B. The
Mhm.
word for calling is actually vocation. Vocation and career are not the same thing. Vocation comes from the Latin word for vocalization, to be called, as in God or something outside of us. And you and I both believe that's God, is looking down and going, dude, this is what you're supposed to be doing, this direction.
Right.
So realize, even the words don't actually mean the same thing. So it is important. And that's a really good distinction to make, that to recognize that they may be 100% aligned in the same thing. They may not be. Both are okay.
So I think that can be really difficult for a lot of people, right? It's a struggle. This whole thing of what do I want to spend the majority of my day doing?
Mhm.
And, so what's the balance to where somebody's not just doing something that they absolutely hate just for the money? Is there a way to, even if it's not 100% the main thing that they're passionate about, at least something that
Yeah.
kind of makes sense in terms of their career, kind of not being so far away from their calling.
Right. Think of it as Venn diagrams, the old fashioned, you did them in school, right? With the circles that
Mhm.
overlap. And the perfect sweet spot is where the the work you do impacts and affects, other people want it. They're impacted by it, they're touched by it, they're affected by it in a positive way. Okay, that's one circle. Another circle is kind of your wiring, what you're made to do, what God has put in your heart, what your passions, your feelings, the things that give you energy, that stuff, who you are, how you're wired. And then the third is also the kind of, how does it impact the larger picture. So what I mean there is that could be family things, because different points in your life, guess what? You're going to have different things calling on your life. When you're a parent, your life looks really different than when you're an empty nester. When you're single, it looks different than if you're in a relationship. So there's the natural changes and ebbs and flows. If all three of those, the sweet spot is in the middle where all of those things are aligned. But guess what? Throughout life, it's almost like those circles are kind of getting bigger and smaller and ebbing and flowing and moving. So, is it always going to be perfectly centered in the middle? Probably not.
Right.
But that's where it's important to have that frame and that realization that your life isn't a static point in time. It's not a photograph. It's a film strip. And sometimes going through those difficult things, it's less about what you're doing and more about what you're becoming or what you're learning. So God sometimes will ask us to do something, again, we're back to pick up your cross and follow me. God's going to ask us at times to do something that we're not comfortable with, that it isn't the most fun thing. It isn't the most pleasant thing. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a purpose behind it that you don't yet see. So, yes, is there that balance between, should you just suck it up and be in an abusive environment where your boss is horrible and, all that? Absolutely not. No human being should be treated like that. Right. And you have every right and responsibility to walk out, leave, quit. I can help you find a different place. We can do that. All of that is real. At the other extreme is a lot of times, especially in the Western culture, we have this feeling that we're all entitled to kind of feel like we never had to work a day in our life and everything should be perfect. And, I should just pray and open the window and a cooked duck flies through it and lands in my lap. And, now that's not the way the world works. That's not how God has set up the world. We still live in a cause and effect world. God has created the world in that way. So there is a balance between those two extremes. Either extreme is foolish. The reality is to move towards the middle where you're going to have to do some things. Again, I feel like I'm living my calling wonderfully today. I don't like sitting down and doing email sequences and writing. That's not my favorite thing to do. It's part of my job, so I get to do that. That's not the part that brings me joy and energy. But man, what it does do is it opens up those opportunities to get on that client call and have that conversation with that woman who's going through a situation where she's got to really get her money in order because she's trying to leave a legacy for her kids and change the family tree. And see that light bulb go off and have her look at me and go, man, we've really only been doing this a couple of weeks and this has already completely changed how I look at money. Okay, so doing the email, sucking that up is worth it to be able to go over here and do the thing that gives me that joy and that energy and makes me sit here and go, man, if I could do this 50 more times today, that'd be awesome. It's that balance and that joining of the two that makes you really thrive.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think, a friend of mine, he had a dilemma one time where he was trying to figure out exactly how to best use his talents, but also what was a good practical career to go into. And he said something, this was a number of years ago, and I thought it was a really smart way to look at it, right? So he always had a passion to like counsel people, and he said, people always come up to me, ask for advice and things like that. So initially he was in college to be a psychologist, and he felt like that's the way that I'll be able to use this gift and this thing that God has put in me. But then later on he said, even though I could go that route, he really wanted to something that was a little bit quicker, so he didn't have to go through all those years of schooling, but still kind of do the same thing. So what he ended up doing, because he also liked the idea of, cutting people's hair and the environment of a barbershop where people are talking and sharing their stories and asking for advice and things like that. And he said, why not, marry the two things? right? So he said, if I go to school for that, like to going to barbering school, I can open up my own, barber shop. And there I'm in an environment where people are coming to me for advice and everything.
Yep.
They may not be coming through their insurance and doing all those things, right? Or it's not necessarily the way I was envisioning it before, but I am still using that gift. I am still touching people in that way, but it just looks a little bit differently than what I was envisioning at first.
Right. Right.
And and then that worked out for him. And then eventually, after doing that for a number of years, he kind of branched out into doing some life coaching
Hmm.
and other things still within that vein, right? But he was
Right.
kind of on a journey. He started somewhere at least,
Hmm.
and naturally life kind of just took him where he needed to go
Right.
with
Yeah,
that.
I was a school teacher for 16 years. I loved that. It fed part of my calling, but then there was things that I didn't like. I went to the corporate world. I did that for 11 years. But a lot of my focus, I did a lot of client work and other things that I didn't love, but a lot of my focus was developing leaders within the company and training and teaching and bringing up new leaders. I love
Mhm.
that. And now as a coach, it's almost like I'm kind of taking some of that teaching thing and some of that leadership development thing and able to do kind of both of those pieces and put them together. It's exactly what you're talking about, where I didn't sit out at the beginning going, oh, I want to be a coach in 25 years or
Mhm.
whatever. That wasn't, I didn't even have that as a thought. But and yet at the same time, what God was putting in my path and the things I was doing was actually developing the skills that now let me run my own business and, you know, work from, I work from home. My commute's, 12 seconds walking down the
Right.
hall, all of that stuff. Exactly the kind of life I want,
Mhm.
but I couldn't have done it. I wouldn't have been able to do it when I was fresh out of college. I didn't have the skill set. I didn't have the knowledge. I didn't have the other things that I developed in the rest of that journey. So you're right. A lot of times it doesn't look like what we thought it was going to be. I'm still a teacher. I'm just a completely different kind of teacher
Mhm.
than I was when I was a student, teaching student science in middle school and high school.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And I know like Robert Kiyosaki is one of those people who's talked about that. And I remember looking at teaching differently, the way that he described teaching when he said, I could be a teacher in the school system because I love teaching, but
Right.
is that the only place where I can teach? Or can I teach people still, but just in a different environment?
Right.
And so he found a way to still do that, right? But just not within the public school system. So, and I think that, it just requires, thinking outside the box to really understand. And for everyone, like for you started out teaching in the school system, but
Mhm.
it doesn't
That's not
mean
why
that
I
just
stayed.
because you started there that you have to continue, with that, right? So,
And there's
y-
other ways I probably could have developed those skills too, but
right.
again, it's back to that idea of that's why I think it's so important to separate calling from career
Hmm.
is, throughout all of those different things I did, career stuff, I was still finding ways to live my calling within it because that calling for me is that development, that pouring into other people. That's what God wired me to do. you
Right.
know, and so I found a way to do it with the kids, and then I found a way to do it in the corporate world, and then now I found a way to do it with this coach. Who knows? This may not even be what I do. I may be doing something different in 15 years. I don't know,
Mhm.
but that undercurrent of my calling will still be there. That I can tell you. It's just it may show up in a different way.
So what did that look like for you? Because I know that there's a lot of people who are probably where you were. They're doing something. They're like, this is a good thing. It's an honorable thing. Being a school teacher, maybe being a firefighter. They might be in politics. Whatever it is that they're doing, people, they're doing something respectable and something that is considered by most people to be a good career. But there's still something within them that says, I should feel more grateful for this. But for some reason, I feel like this just isn't it. I
Mhm.
think it's time for me to transition into something else. But I'm afraid to take that leap because I don't know what's on the other side. So what would you say to somebody like that?
Yeah. So there's two sides to that question. One is emotional and the other is practical.
Mhm.
Um, Both, by the way, are vital. So because a lot of times people focus on just the practical or just the emotional.
Right.
And I think both are vital. So just for arbitrary sake, let's talk about the practical first. So the practical is things like, have you saved up some money so that you can pay your bills while you're looking for something new? Have you identified what skills you might need to develop? And while you're still employed doing that thing that's not your favorite thing, but it's not a bad thing,
Mm.
are you developing those skills and maybe doing night class or doing something else? Is there a way you could start something on the side while you're still employed? And then as it grows, instead of having to jump from the boat over a big gap, into the dock, maybe you could get
Mhm.
the boat a little closer, and start the thing already and get it going.
Right.
Yeah, it's not your full-time job income, but it's feeding the, it's bringing in some money. And by the way, that thing gives you some extra money to do some other things like save up some money,
Mhm.
build a runway. So are you doing some things to kind of build the structure of the skills and the money and the identification? That's the other thing, testing things out. You think you want to be a teacher. Okay, great. Go substitute for a little while in the, for a summer, or go find a way to teach a night class or teach online or go tutor or something. Find a way to test out, not the full necessarily, but enough of the thing that you think you're being called to do to get that feedback of, oh, wow, this really is more in alignment with what I want to do. Test it in
Right.
a way. So that's the practical side. The emotional side is much more about recognizing, again, we're back to those frames of reference of your life is a film strip, not a photograph. So where you are today isn't where you have to stay.
Mhm.
So what can I do to frame so that this change doesn't feel like it's so overwhelming? By the way, you'll notice this kind of dovetails into what we were just talking about with the practical,
Mhm.
because as you get some money saved up, well, now that voice in your head that's going, I'm going to starve, I'm going to be homeless, I'm going to be living under a bridge, all of those things, it gets a little quieter. By the way, it doesn't go away completely. Okay. I don't
Mm.
care how much money you have in the bank, there's still a part of you that's afraid. That's part of why God talks to us so much about our relationship with money, is because money weighs on our heart in a way that very few other things do. And so that feeling of I'm not going to have enough, I'm not going to be able to do it, it's going to be there. So it's the emotional side is learning to dance with that feeling, to get comfortable with it, to understand where it's coming from. By the way,
Mhm.
God put that in us for a reason. It's to protect us. That literal voice is there to try to be your friend and protect you. The problem is sometimes it's overprotective. Sometimes it's like that helicopter parent that's telling the kid, no, 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 don't do that. Don't do that. You'll get hurt. You'll get hurt. Don't do that. Sometimes your kid needs to fall down and bump their knee, to learn, sometimes they need to touch that thing and realize, ooh, I don't want to touch that. That hurts. Same
Mhm.
thing. God does that for us. Sometimes we need to have that bump or that bruise, and that inner voice can be almost overprotective and holding us back from doing those changes. So that's where you have to do some self work. Work with a coach, work with a counselor, work with other people to, do things like the DISC assessment, do things like personality profiles and career profiles, do things like test things out on the side, do things like put some things in place to help quiet that voice so that you know where it's coming from, and you can at least dance with it in a way where it doesn't hold you back. Because, the truth is there's kind of two fears, and they're really the same fear. What is the fear of success? What if I go do this thing and it takes off? The other is the fear of failure. What if I do this thing and it doesn't take off? They're really the same fear. They're just almost like two sides of the coin, where
Right.
our brain is telling us, stay where you are because it's comfortable and I know what it feels like. Even if it's not perfect, I'm comfortable here. It's kind of
Mm.
like getting out of bed on that cold winter morning where the alarm clock's going off and you're like, I really don't want to get out of bed. It's warm and it's comfortable. But if you don't get out of bed, the rest of the day doesn't happen. Christmas morning doesn't happen till you get out of bed.
Mhm.
Those gifts don't come till you get out of bed. The same thing happens to us when we're kind of in those places where we're stuck in the in between.
Mm. Yeah, and I know that this is actually one of the things that you mentioned in your book. Um, so in your book, Inspired Living, right? This is, one of the things that you mentioned, like transitioning from a job that you hate to a calling that you love. And I know that you said that sometimes it doesn't always mean leave your job right now,
Right.
right? Sometimes maybe you can find that calling even within something that you're already doing,
Yeah.
right? And then for some people it might mean, doing something completely different, but I guess it's a different thing for each person. So I want you to talk a little bit about the framework that you've developed and that you use in your book, Inspired Living. What does that framework involve?
Yeah. So there's a couple of different frameworks in the book, but because I tend to teach things through systems, processes, habits, and frameworks rather
Mhm.
than, just exercises. And the reason why is frameworks kind of apply in many different places. So I like using those because it's almost like putting tools in your toolbox as opposed to, just solving the immediate problem. So
Right, right.
the framework, the main framework that kind of the book is set up with is this idea of invest in yourself, invest in others, develop your influence and impact the world. So breaking that down. So invest in yourself is what we were just talking about. That's doing that self introspection. That's doing that self work. Sometimes that's figuring out what is that limiting belief that's holding me back. Sometimes it's doing the exercise that we talked about earlier and beginning to identify the patterns that God has put in your heart and your mind of where you should go. Sometimes it's about, what I need to do this thing. I want to do this thing, but I don't have the skill yet to do it. So I need to go back to school or I need to get a training or I need to get a certificate. That investing in yourself can look like a lot of different things. Sometimes it's about a practical thing like saving up some money or paying off some debt or doing something like that. So it's that combination of both mental or emotional and kind of physical, practical things that get you in a position where you can now start doing the next step. These aren't really linear, by the way. They kind of all blend together and kind of turn into a big circle too, because as you get to the end, you kind of start over at the beginning. So investing in others is kind of the second piece of the framework. This is what I was talking about earlier when I was saying, go find a way to do it in a small scale and test it.
Mhm.
This is putting it out there. This is starting to work with somebody or interact with other people. And you get feedback from that. What comes back to you, see, God oftentimes doesn't speak to us in just auditory voice from above. I mean, I'm not saying that never happens, but more often than not, when God speaks to us, it's through the voice of other people. So
Mm.
all of a sudden that person you're working with says something to you or reacts to something you do, or they'll even suggest something like, it'd be really nice if you could do this. And you're like, well, I can do that. Let's do that. You
Mhm.
know, and all of a sudden you start getting this feedback from the world because you're pouring it out and putting it out there where other people can react to it. And that gives you feedback that you can then refine things on. Naturally, as you do that, what happens is you begin to have influence because now all of a sudden people are looking at you and going, hey, you're good at whatever. Hey, this is the person I need to talk to about that thing. That you begin, and by the way, you're in a corporate job, you could develop that influence inside that corporate job, or it could be outside of that job out here. It could be at church. It could be, on the side somewhere in a side hustle or a side gig. The where and the what is kind of the logistical piece, but that influence is going to naturally happen as you begin to put that out in the world, which then also naturally leads to the last step, which is impact the world. Just like we were
Mhm.
talking about earlier, this is that idea of those ripples going out and beginning to make an impact, to beginning to make changes in other people's lives that then kind of spread out from there. And what you'll find is this, like most of the frameworks that I teach, is somewhat iterative, and that as you invest in yourself, you're naturally going to want to invest in others. And because of that, it's going to show you places where you need to go back and invest in yourself. Same thing happens as you develop your influence. Naturally, out of that influence is going to come things that give you opportunities to invest in others that also then show you where you need to invest in yourself. So it goes both directions up and down that framework. And over time, you'll begin to live more authentically into your calling as you kind of go through those phases.
Yeah, and there's a word that you said in there, time. Time, right, is a very important resource, right, that we have to be stewards over. So there are some people that say, like, okay, yeah, Scott, I understand what you're saying. I do want to do that, but I don't have time.
Yep.
I'm busy. I have a family. I work. I don't have time to really do all this stuff, right? And so because they say they don't have time, then they just don't do it at all.
Mhm.
So what do you say to somebody who is struggling because of time?
So change your language. Here's what I mean by that. There's a really small tweak that you can do that, believe it or not, will impact the way you use your time fantastically. It dramatically changes people's philosophy. Here's the impact. Stop saying, I don't have time. And instead, when you're making that choice, say, this isn't a priority to me. Just changing the way you say it will actually change your behavior. Because here's why. Let me say something to you. Imagine for a minute that you're that guy or gal who's working that 9 to 5. You're putting bread on the table. You're the provider for the family. Okay. I don't care if you're a man or a woman, doesn't matter. You're out there, you're making things happen. You're that person, that type A career focused person. You're putting money on that's what you do. You provide. You're taking good care of your family, and your kid's soccer game is coming up. It's real easy for you to say, well, I don't have time to make it to the kids' soccer game. I'm out here moving and shaking, I'm making things happen. I'm providing, I'm doing a good job. I don't have time to make it to the kids' soccer game. Nobody will even look at you twice. People will just go, yeah, you're busy. I get it. But if instead out loud you say to yourself and to others, you know what? It's not a priority for me to go to my daughter's soccer game.
Right.
That feels completely different. Now all of a sudden everybody's going to be looking at you going, really? you know,
Yeah, like, oh, that's harsh, man. Like, well,
it's harsh, man. You know, it's not a priority for me to make date night with my wife. It's not a priority for me to work on this side hustle that I think is really going to be the thing that I'm supposed to do. It's not a priority for me to, that feels different. And by the way, if you say out loud, it's not a priority for me to do this, and you go, yeah, it's not a priority for me to do that, then don't do that. It's perfectly okay. This isn't about making you do more stuff. This is about making you do the stuff that actually matters.
right, right.
Okay. It's because all of a sudden, when you say out loud, it's not a priority for me to do this, and you get that feeling in your gut that's like, really, dude? Come on. Now you're going to go do it. But on the other hand, when it's that thing that really and truly it isn't a priority, and who cares? You know what I mean? And you say out loud, it's not a priority for me to do that right now. Yeah, it's really not a priority for me to do that. Okay, then don't do it and don't feel guilty. Just don't do it. It's okay. So it lets us choose to use our time in a different way by just that small little tweak of changing the language. I mean, there's a lot of other things we can talk about, budgeting and practical tools, but the quickest and easiest way I've found to make people start to recognize that you do have time, you're just choosing to spend it in other ways, is to just change the way you talk about it.
hmm So we've talked about stewardship of finances. We've talked about the stewardship of time. Is there anything else that we should really be focusing on when it comes to stewardship? Something that people don't always prioritize, or maybe just it just goes over their heads.
So let's back up a step too. And I mentioned earlier, I'll define the word stewardship. I'd like to kind of do that now because I think it kind of answers your question in a way. So the word stewardship biblically, if you think about the Bible, a lot of the examples that are used in the New Testament are agrarian. They're in a time in the world where people were farmers, and there was the Lord and the castle, and there were people living on the farms. That's the kind of King James Bible that we're all kind of familiar with. And so a lot of the examples and the parables are kind of set in that context. Obviously, we don't live in that context anymore. And that's one of the reasons that those words sound weird to us. So a steward at that time was the person that lived in the Lord's castle, that worked for the Lord, but didn't own anything. They were the logistics person. They were the one that made sure that the crops got planted, and a certain amount of taxes got paid, and if there was a leak in the roof, it got patched, and that the horses were taken care of, and the cows got fed, and they were kind of the major domo, the person that they made everything happen, but none of the stuff that they were in control over was their stuff. Okay. So they often were blessed with a nice house and a nice place to stay, but it wasn't theirs. Okay. Go ahead.
So is that like the difference between saying somebody is an owner versus somebody's a manager, right, or a supervisor?
We nowadays would call that person kind of a manager, or the logistics person, or they're the general manager of the hotel, but they don't own the hotel, right? They're just the manager. They're still an owner somewhere. Same thing. And by the way, notice the language. The Lord, God, is the owner, and the steward, that's us, is just the manager, right? Just the person that's the manager. And all of a sudden, what that means is anything that God puts in your domain, anything that God puts in front of you, it's not yours, but it is yours to steward. It's yours to make sure it's being used in a way that furthers the kingdom of God, or sometimes I like to call it the kingdom of God, as in, kin, brothers and sisters, right? It's the thing that makes the impact. It makes the difference. It means that when you're spending that dollar bill, or spending that minute of time, or spending that conversation with your wife or your child, it's when you're teaching your kid how to tie their shoes. It's when you're walking out to get the mail in the morning. All of those things are opportunities to steward the gifts that God has given you, so that you can do things with them that make an impact in a positive way on God's kingdom. Because guess what? You're going to make an impact, and you're going to have influence. You get to choose whether it's good or bad, but it's going to happen anyway. You could either be the bad example, or you could be the good example, but you're going to be an example. So it's that kind of mindset and philosophy that makes you stop thinking about, is it money? Is it time? Is it energy? Is it, it's all of those things. It's the words we speak. It's how we speak them. It's the time we spend. It's how we spend it. It's the money we earn. It's the difference between getting your check on Friday and looking down and going, oh, thank God I got my check, and looking down at your check and going, thank God I got my check. God gave me this, right? It's a difference in the way you look at it. And the neat thing is, it'll make you a bigger giver, because all of a sudden, guess what? When you're writing that check to the charity, it's not your money anyway. It's a lot easier to write that check when it's not my money. It's God's telling me to write a check. I'm writing a check. Here's the check. Right. That's it. Because think about it. If you're the comptroller for your business, and you're the guy that writes the checks, or the guy that writes the check, and the owner comes in and goes, hey, dude, write a $50,000 check to this charity. You look at him and go, okay. You don't go, oh, 50,000, really? I don't know if I can afford that. It's not yours. Right. You just write the check and send it off. So it's kind of having that. It makes you a bigger giver. It makes you more able to take the things that you have and have gratitude for them and contentment with them, where I've had a lot in my life, and I'm content when I've had a lot. I've had almost nothing in my life, and I've been content when I had nothing. By the way, content doesn't mean complacent. It doesn't mean you want to stay there, but it just means I'm okay. I woke up this morning and I'm seeing flowers instead of roots. It's a good day.
So it's not an excuse to be lazy.
No, it's not an excuse to sit back and be lazy. It's not an excuse to say, if my faith was better, God would provide for me. That, by the way, that's not in the Bible. Look for it. It's not in there. Right. It's not any of those things that you unfortunately see as sort of this weird message that we get in the Christian church about stewardship. They're going through a hard time. I guess their faith isn't strong enough. That's not how that works. Oftentimes we go through a hard time because our faith is strong enough. I would actually flip that around and say sometimes it's the opposite, because God knows that they need to put you through this crucible because of something that's coming down the pike that you don't even know yet. So it's all of these things that lets us look at it from less of a what resource am I supposed to steward, and everything that I have I'm supposed to steward.
Yeah, yeah. And there's one more thing that I really do want to ask you when it comes to this before we wrap things up. It's that, there's a parable that Jesus teaches about stewardship, and it's with the talents, right? He gives these three servants talents, and it talks about how with two of them he was pleased with it, pleased with them because they invested it and they did something with it. But there was one that didn't do anything with it. So as we look at that in the 21st century, right? We're in 2024, getting ready to go into 2025. And as you read something like that, with your background, with what you've been studying, with how you've been coaching people and everything, what's something that you really feel like the Lord is speaking to his people
Mhm.
when it comes to a parable like that?
And that, I love that parable. It's in Matthew. And the reason I love it is because it's got a lot of different layers to it. Okay. So I'm going to kind of peel the onion for a minute. So layer one that you can get from it, just empirically. So first off, a talent. So we hear the word talent, we think of like something that people are good at, right? He's got a natural talent. Okay. Talent in this context is actually a denomination of money. Okay. So there were denarii, there were talents. Talents nowadays, think of that as like a year's wages for like 10 men.
Mm.
Okay. So if the average person in America makes $60,000 a year, that's like $600,000. Okay. This is like, so when he gave somebody one talent, this is like handing someone $1 million. Okay. This isn't like chump change. This wasn't pennies. This was a lot of money. And he gives one talent to one person. He gives two to another, gives five to the other, right? Or slightly different ratios and different translations, but it's
Right.
boils down to three different amounts. And it even says he gave it to them according to their giftings, according to their talents, their way of being. In other words, when he gave one to somebody, it was because he knew that person could only handle one. When he gave two to somebody, it's because he can only handle two, or she. When five, they can handle five, right? It was the Lord was blessing these people with what they didn't deserve, but what they could handle. The one that got five went out and did some shrewd things with it and grew it. And the Lord came back and they said, "Hey, Lord, here's 10." Notice they didn't keep them. They didn't grow it for themselves. They gave it back to the Lord and said, "Here's what I did for you." And the Lord said, "I'm pleased with you." One said, "I have two." Went out, did shrewd dealings, came back and gave back four. Again, "I'm pleased with you." The one that the Lord was unpleased with, it's not because he didn't grow it. It's because he hid it. He literally hid his talent. Modern times, think about what that means, right? If we use talent in the other sense of the word, it means God said, "You're supposed to do something with this. I'm giving this to you. I'm giving this to your care, not so you can hide it, not so you can protect it, not so you can do nothing with it, but so that you can grow it for the good of me, honestly, for the good of the Lord." And instead of doing that, he hid it away. He buried it in the ground, is what some translations say. That's the thing that got God angry, got the Lord angry. It's not in other words, if he had gone out and done something, I truly believe if he'd gone out and done something and lost the money, God would have said, "Well, I wish you would have done better, because I know you have it in you. I gave you what you were capable of doing something with, and you chose not to do anything at all."
Mm.
It gets back to what you were talking about. When you're saying things like, "I don't have time for that." When you're saying things like, "Well, I know that's what God wants me to do, but I just can't do that. There's no way I could make a living. There's no way I could feed my family. I just can't do that. Instead of getting creative and going, that's what God wants me to do. How can I do that? How can I make this happen? You're effectively being that person with the one talent. You're saying, God has given this to me, and God has given me something that I'm perfectly capable. God knows this. God knows me. He knows how he's wired. He built me. He knows what's in me. He knows I'm capable of handling this. And I'm going, you know what? I know better than you. I'm not able to handle that. I'm not able to do that. I'm going to go bury it away. That's what God doesn't want to have happen. That's what created that disappointment. And I actually think it was probably more disappointment than anger. It was more of a chance of, I think about it. You've all felt, if you're a parent, you have children, you've had that emotion at once or twice, and you got to work on it and work with your kid on it, where it's like, I know you could have done better. I know you could have done more. You've got it in you. And what can I do to lift you up and grow you and make you move? And so that's really the difference. It isn't because I think a lot of times we focus on the 5 became 10, the 2 became 4. And it's not that 2 became 4 that I think brought the, good job. I think it's that you did something with what I gave you that I knew you were capable of doing something with. That's the part that brought joy.
Yeah. And I think that for some people, and especially whether it's in the church world, right? People think, oh, okay, if I have a huge ministry with 10,000 people and I'm on big stages, then that means that I've made it, right? In the church world. Like that means that I've used this. But if it's a smaller thing, then that means that, okay, I must not be doing it well enough. I'm not like the people on TV. That means that something's wrong, right? So what do you say to somebody like that?
Well, if that was true, then the pleasure would have been with the one that made 5 into 10, and the one that made 2 into 4, and the one that hit it. Both of them wouldn't have done well. Again, it wasn't. I truly believe, even if the one had become 0, but he really truly tried, he'd done what God put him out there to do, I still think God would have looked at him and said, I'm pleased. We need to, I need to give you more opportunities for growth. I need to, help you develop more. I need to challenge you more, but I'm still pleased. I'm not angry with you. I'm not upset with you. I'm not disappointed in you. I'm just, I know you need more help, and what can I do to put things in your way that will help you? God gives us free will too. We have to pick it up. God offers us help, but we have to take it. And it's that idea of equating the size of something in worldly terms. Realize you're measuring it only by what you can see. And God doesn't measure the world by what we see. God measures the world by what God sees, and God doesn't see what we see. Again, I'm back to that. I was a teacher. I taught at a small private school. It had, 412 students, K-12. There were 400 students on the campus, K-12. Okay. Little tiny, I teach a class of 12 people. 8, 10, 12 that I can think of are now doctors. Does that not have an impact? And yet numerically, if I counted it by the size of the school or the number of kids or, all these sort of work, even my paycheck, quite frankly, any of the worldly measures that you can measure it by, it was a small impact. And yet in a different way, I know that impact was multiplied and bigger and larger and went out. So I don't think we can measure it by, so I've said this to church folks a lot, a lot of times, and it happens in the church where we focus on, how many people are in the pews on Sunday, and that becomes our measure of the success of the church. I want to know how many people outside of the church are we touching? That's to me the measure of the true church. So I used to go to a very small church, had less than 100 people every Sunday in worship. Our food ministry, we fed over 1,400 people a month. 80 people in the pews, fed 1,400 people. I look at that and go, that's impact, Right. So we don't look at it. And again, it's not about it being 1,400 people. It's just about that ratio of, small numbers, but we found a way to do something that rippled out into the community and made a difference in that community. And that's the way we've got to look at it. rather than just looking at it from the measures of success that we use in the world, because that's way too narrow-minded, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think that a lot of pastors probably, if they're honest, they say, yeah, it's great to impact the community, but can we have 1,400 people in the pews and maybe we reach 80 people outside with the food? Like,
Yeah.
because it's just because of the way that people think.
Yeah.
They're thinking, I want to see a crowd because that means I'm successful. And if I don't see,
But I'm reaching people, right? Because I'm talking to them.
right,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it happens in everything. I'm a podcaster. You're a podcaster. How many downloads do you get a month?
right,
You go to a podcasting conference, everyone's asking that question.
hmm
Why? Because the real truth is that what matters? Well, yeah and no. It does and it doesn't, because if you reach 1,000 people a month, but really and truly you don't make any sort of impact on their life, this is just, something that goes in one ear and out the other, and somebody else reaches 5, but it really dramatically changes those 5 people's lives in some way and touches them.
right,
And which one really had the bigger impact?
mhm,
And you don't get to see that from the kind of vanity numbers,
right,
how many Twitter, X, Facebook, Instagram, Snap, whatever, how many whatevers you have, it's
mhm.
all of those things are really just, those are more about our pride and our vanity than they are about actual impact, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
And yet it's really hard to think that way. I've been doing this for a long time. I still look at, oh, look, I lost some, listeners last month. Oh, that's,
mhm.
it's still going to affect you, but you've got to learn to reframe that and step back and go, but wait a minute, what's the actual impact that I'm trying to make? Am I still doing that?
Right, right. Yeah, and I guess it can be easy to lose sight of what was the original intent of this in the first place,
Right.
right? And looking at it as you mentioned, are they my listeners, right? Or are these God's people that he's sending to me and he wants me to impact? If he wants me to impact more, then he'll send more.
Then he'll
If he
send more.
doesn't, if he doesn't, then he'll send what he's sending, right? It's a matter of ultimately it's up to him, right?
It-
And yeah, I do think that if more people could understand that and grasp that, right, it would just reduce a lot of anxiety
yeah.
about all of these measures, all of these standards that we put on ourselves that maybe the Lord isn't even putting on us.
Right.
Right.
And it's a weird tension because it's a both and, right? Earlier we talked about being lazy and sitting back and
Mhm.
going, oh, if I pray, God will provide. And, that's
Right.
how God set up this universe. I think it's a weird both and. In fact, this is actually going to be the topic of my next book that I'm already
Mhm.
working on, is this way of living in what I call the both and. So as humans, we tend to try to put things into categories of either or, you know, either my podcast reaches 1 million people or, I don't reach anybody.
Mhm.
It's always these sorts of extreme dichotomies, either end, where I think a lot of times God calls us to live in a very uncomfortable place, which is it's both and, it's both of these things. It's about an impact that isn't just about do you reach 1 million people? It's about living in that tension of I am both faithful and know that God will provide and God will send this and my security is in God. And at the same time, I'm going to work and I'm going to hustle and I'm going to be diligent and I'm going to take good care of the resources he's given me. And I'm not going to squander them because that's also a good thing, and yet those seem like they're almost contradictory. You can't be in both of those places at once because they seem sort of opposite to us, when in reality they're not, because they're really just two different ways of looking at the same thing. Um, and so it's this idea of living in what I call the both and, that kind of uncomfortable in between. And I don't yet know exactly how to explain that fully. That's why it's going to be the next book, not my first book. But it's that tension that I think we've got to live into.
Now, for those people who say that topic, right, what you're talking about there, yeah, I need that book, but I don't have time to wait for that book. I need to talk to you tomorrow, yesterday, right? And they say, how do I connect with you, right? How do I, benefit from some of the like the coaching services that you offer?
So I actually put together a landing page just for your listeners. So if they go over to my website, which is inspiredstewardship.com, and then just /FIYA, so FIYA, just like the podcast, and put that in. So that's inspiredstewardship.com/FIYA. Go there, and there's actually a link up top where you can get some free resources. So some of these exercises we talked about tonight in the areas of time, talent, and treasures are up there. There's information about my podcast. There's information about my first book, Inspired Living, that we were talking about. You can get on my mailing list and find out when the next book's coming out. And then there's also a way you can book a call. So if you'd like to jump on a 30-minute call, just chat about where you're at and whether or not working together would make sense, you can certainly do that as well. All of that is over at inspiredstewardship.com/FIYA.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. And I'll also put that in the description for everyone as well, so they can just click on that and easily get to it.
Awesome.
Yep. So, thank you, Scott, so much for, just hanging out with us today and, sharing all of this wisdom. And I really do believe that this is, you've already been impacting lives with this message of the importance of stewardship, right? And I know that there's a lot of people who will be impacted by this conversation. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you for having me.
Yep, no problem.